Hello Guy, welcome back to my new channel. Tonight we sail into the heart of the Aegean, to the island of Crete, a land of rugged mountains and sun-drenched shores. Here, long before the golden age of Athens or the legions of Rome, Europe's first great civilization rose from the sea. They were the Minoans, a brilliant and enigmatic Bronze Age people who built vast labyrinthine palaces, created art that celebrated life and nature with a joyful intensity, and dominated the seas with their powerful fleet. Theirs was a world of bull leapers, snake goddesses, and a mysterious, unreadable language. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the Minoans does not begin with the archaeologist's trowel, but with the poet's voice. For millennia before their civilization was ever known to history, the Minoans existed as a powerful and mysterious echo in the myths of ancient Greece. They were the people of the legendary King Minos, a mighty and just ruler of the seas, a son of the great god Zeus himself. His kingdom, Crete, was the setting for some of the most famous and enduring of all Greek myths, the tale of the Labyrinth and the fearsome Minotaur. The story, as told by later Greek and Roman writers, is a dark and captivating one. King Minos, to prove his divine right to rule, prayed to the sea god Poseidon to send him a magnificent white bull from the waves, which he promised to sacrifice in the god's honor. Poseidon granted his wish, and a bull of unparalleled beauty emerged from the sea. But Minos, struck by the animal's perfection, was overcome with greed. He decided to keep the divine bull for his own herds and sacrificed a lesser one in its place. Enraged by this act of hubris and betrayal, Poseidon took a terrible revenge. He afflicted Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, with a monstrous and unnatural passion for the white bull. Consumed by this divine madness, Pasiphae sought the help of the master craftsman and inventor Daedalus, who had taken refuge in her husband's court. Daedalus, a man of genius, constructed a hollow wooden cow, covered it with a real cowhide, and wheeled it into the meadow where the bull grazed. Pasiphae hid inside this decoy, and the great white bull, deceived, mated with it. From this unnatural union, a horrifying creature was born, the Minotaur, a monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull. Horrified and shamed, King Minos could not bring himself to kill the creature. Instead, he once again commanded Daedalus to use his skill, this time to construct a prison from which the monster could never escape. Daedalus built the Labyrinth, a vast, complex and inescapable maze at the heart of the king's palace at Knossos. It was here that the Minotaur was imprisoned. To feed the beast, Minos exacted a grim tribute from the city of Athens, which he had defeated in a war. Every 9 years, the Athenians were forced to send 7 of their finest young men and 7 of their most beautiful maidens to Crete, to be sent into the labyrinth and devoured by the Minotaur. This terrible tribute continued until the great Athenian hero Theus volunteered to be one of the victims. With the help of Minos' own daughter, the princess Ariadne, who fell in love with him, Theus was able to slay the Minotaur and find his way out of the labyrinth by following a thread she had given him. For thousands of years, this was all the world knew of the ancient civilization of Crete. It was a world of myth and legend, of gods, monsters, and heroes. No one knew if there was any historical truth behind these fantastical tales. The answer to that question would have to wait for the arrival of a stubborn, wealthy, and brilliantly obsessive English archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans. The late 19th century was a heroic age of archaeology, an era when intrepid individuals with a passion for the ancient world were making discoveries that would rewrite history. The most famous of these was the German businessman Heinrich Schliemann, who, by following the epic poems of Homer, had discovered the lost city of Troy and the magnificent gold-filled tombs of the Mycenaean kings in Greece. Schliemann's discoveries proved that the world of the Greek myths was not just a collection of stories, but was based on a real, historical Bronze Age civilization. But Schliemann had also noticed something strange. At the Mycenaean sites, and in the antique shops of Athens, he had seen small engraved seal stones with a mysterious hieroglyphic-like script that was clearly not Greek. When he asked where they came from, the answer was always the same: Crete. It was these mysterious seal stones that captured the imagination of Arthur Evans. Evans was a man of considerable wealth, and the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. He became convinced that these stones were the key to a lost pre-Greek system of writing, the script of the people Homer called the Aeteo-Cretans, or true Cretans. He began to travel to Crete, which was then still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and to buy up as many of these milkstones, as the local women called them, as he could find. He became obsessed with finding their source. His attention was drawn to a large, low hill at a place called Kephala, just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion. The hill was known to be the site of the ancient city of Knossos, the legendary capital of King Minos. Evans, believing this was the source of his script, used his personal fortune to buy the entire hill. In 1900, after Crete had finally won its independence, he began to dig. What he found exceeded his wildest dreams. Within days of starting the excavation, his teams of workers began to uncover the remains of a vast and incredibly complex building, a structure far larger and more sophisticated than any of the Mycenaean palaces on the Greek mainland. As they dug deeper, they revealed a sprawling, multi-storied complex of hundreds of interconnected rooms, corridors, and courtyards. There were grand staircases, advanced drainage systems with terracotta pipes, and vast storage magazines filled with giant pottery jars. The walls were covered in vibrant and beautiful fresco paintings, depicting a world of leaping dolphins, elegant ladies, and strange acrobatic bull-leaping rituals. It was a civilization unlike any that had been seen before. Evans realized that he had not just found the source of his script. He had discovered a completely unknown Bronze Age civilization, one that was older and in many ways more advanced than the Mycenaean culture of mainland Greece. He had found Europe's first great civilization. The sheer complexity of the palace, with its maze-like layout of rooms and corridors, immediately brought to his mind the ancient myth. He was convinced he had found the very labyrinth of King Minos, and so he named the civilization he had discovered the Minoans. For the next 3 decades, Evans dedicated his life and his fortune to the excavation of Knossos. His work was both brilliant and, by modern standards, deeply controversial. He was not content to simply excavate the ruins. He sought to bring them back to life. Using the then-new technology of reinforced concrete, he began to reconstitute, as he called it, large sections of the palace. He re-erected the fallen columns. He rebuilt the grand staircases. And he had his team of artists painstakingly restore the fragmentary frescoes, often based on his own highly imaginative interpretations of the surviving pieces. The result is the Knossos that millions of tourists visit today, a vivid but heavily restored vision of a lost world. Modern archaeologists are often highly critical of Evans's methods, arguing that his concrete reconstructions are inaccurate and have permanently damaged the original remains, making it impossible to re-examine the evidence. His interpretation of the finds has also been challenged. He identified a throne room, a priest-king relief, and a customs house, imposing his own preconceived notions of a European-style monarchy onto the evidence. Despite these controversies, Evans's achievement was monumental. He was a meticulous excavator for his time, and his detailed, multi-volume publication of his findings, The Palace of Minos, remains a foundational work of Aegean archaeology. He established the basic chronological framework for Minoan civilization, dividing it into early, middle, and late Minoan periods, a system that is still in use today, and he did indeed find his scripts. He identified a very early pictographic script, which he called Cretan hieroglyphic, and 2 later cursive scripts, which he named Linear A and Linear B. Evans spent the rest of his life trying to decipher these scripts, but he would ultimately fail. He was convinced that the underlying language was a mysterious, non-Greek language he called Minoan. It would not be until after his death that the brilliant young architect Michael Ventris would prove that the later script, Linear B, was in fact an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaean conquerors who had occupied Knossos in its final days. Linear A, the true language of the Minoans, remains undeciphered to this day. The discovery of the Minoan civilization was a revolution in our understanding of the ancient world. Evans had unearthed a lost chapter of European history. He had proven that a sophisticated, literate, and highly artistic urban civilization had flourished on Crete 1,000 years before the golden age of Athens. He had revealed the historical reality that lay behind the Greek myths. The labyrinth was not a fictional maze, but a distant, distorted memory of the great, complex palace at Knossos. King Minos was not just a figure of legend, but the name that preserved the memory of a dynasty of powerful Bronze Age sea kings. And the Minotaur, the fearsome bullman, was a reflection of the central and sacred role that the bull played in the art and ritual of this mysterious and captivating civilization. Evans, like Theseus, had entered the labyrinth, and by slaying the monster of ignorance, he had revealed to the world the secrets of Europe's first great civilization. The power and prosperity of Minoan Crete was built upon a foundation of wood and water. Unlike the great land-based empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which drew their strength from the control of vast agricultural territories and the command of massive armies, the Minoans were a people of the sea. Their civilization was a thalassocracy, from the Greek words thalassa sea and kratean to rule, a maritime empire whose power was projected not by legions marching on land, but by fleets of ships sailing the open waters of the Aegean. This unique, sea-based power structure shaped every aspect of their society, from the location of their cities to the very design of their magnificent palaces. The Minoans were the first great naval power in European history, and for centuries they were the undisputed masters of the eastern Mediterranean, their ships weaving a web of trade and cultural influence that connected the island of Crete to the wider world. The key to understanding the Minoan Thalassocracy is the geography of Crete itself. Crete is a large mountainous island, strategically located in the heart of the Aegean Sea. It is a natural stepping stone, a perfect crossroads between the three great landmasses of the ancient world: Greece to the north, Egypt to the south, and the Near East to the east. This prime location made it the ideal hub for a long-distance trade network. The island itself was rich in natural resources. Its fertile plains and valleys produced valuable agricultural goods, including olive oil, wine, grain, and saffron, a highly prized spice and dye derived from the crocus flower. The island was also covered in dense forests of cypress and cedar, which provided the essential timber for their shipbuilding industry. From the great port cities on the island's northern and eastern coasts, the Minoan ships, depicted in their art as sleek, single-masted vessels with high, curved prows, would set sail. They were master navigators, capable of undertaking long, open-water voyages. They sailed north to the islands of the Cyclades and the Greek mainland, trading their goods and establishing outposts. They sailed east to the coast of Anatolia and the Levant, where they interacted with the great cultures of the Near East. And most importantly, they sailed south, across the Libyan Sea, to the ancient and powerful kingdom of Egypt. The relationship with Egypt was a particularly important one. Egyptian tomb paintings from the New Kingdom, such as those in the tomb of the Vizier Rekhmire, depict men from a land they called Keftiu, who are almost certainly Minoans. These men are shown bringing tribute or trade goods to the Egyptian court, and their clothing, their hairstyles, and the vessels they carry are identical to those seen in the frescoes of Knossos. The Minoans traded their olive oil, their timber, and their fine pottery for Egypt's gold, ivory, and exotic goods, and most importantly, they absorbed the artistic and technological ideas of this much older civilization. This extensive trade network brought immense wealth back to the island of Crete. This wealth was not distributed evenly, but was concentrated in the hands of a powerful elite who controlled the production and export of these goods. It was this elite that funded and directed the construction of some of the most remarkable architectural complexes of the ancient world: the great Minoan palaces. The palaces at Knossos, Phistos, Malea, and Zakros were not just the residences of the ruling class, they were the central hubs of the entire Minoan state, the nerve centers that combined the functions of a royal court, an administrative center, a religious sanctuary, and a major economic warehouse and factory, all under one vast roof. The architecture of these palaces is a direct expression of the Minoan worldview and their unique thalassocratic power. The most striking and most significant feature of all the major Minoan palaces is their complete lack of fortifications. Unlike the heavily walled citadels of the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland, or the fortified cities of Mesopotamia, the Minoan palaces were open and accessible, sprawling out into the surrounding landscape. This is a stunning and profound statement. It suggests that the Minoans lived in a state of relative peace and security, a pax Minoica, or Minoan peace, that lasted for centuries. Their security did not depend on land-based armies and massive defensive walls. Their primary defense was their powerful navy, which controlled the surrounding seas, deterring any potential invader long before they could reach the shores of Crete. Their fleet was their wall, a floating fortification that allowed their domestic culture to flourish in an atmosphere of unparalleled peace and openness. The Greek historian Thucydides, writing 1,000 years later, preserved a memory of this, stating that the legendary King Minos was the first person to organize a navy and that he cleared the sea of pirates. The heart of each Minoan palace was a large, rectangular central courtyard. This was not a decorative feature but the functional and ceremonial core of the entire complex. The courtyard was the main thoroughfare, the primary source of light and air for the surrounding rooms, and the stage for the great public ceremonies and rituals that were central to Minoan life, including, almost certainly, the dangerous and acrobatic bull-leaping spectacle. All the other parts of the palace, the residential quarters, the administrative offices, the religious shrines and the storage magazines, were arranged around this central hub. The palaces were multi-storied structures, with grand staircases connecting the different levels. The builders used a distinctive and elegant architectural element, the downward tapering wooden column, which was often painted a deep, vibrant red, and topped with a large, round, pillow-like capital. To illuminate the deep interior spaces of these sprawling complexes, the architects developed an ingenious feature known as the light well. These were small, open-air shafts that were left open to the sky, and which would funnel light and fresh air down into the lower levels of the building. The palaces also featured some of the most advanced plumbing and sanitation systems in the ancient world. They had bathrooms and latrines that were connected by a sophisticated network of underground terracotta pipes, which provided fresh water and carried away sewage. The layout of the palaces, particularly the largest, at Knossos, can seem confusing and maze-like to a modern visitor. This has often been linked to the myth of the Labyrinth. However, the palaces were not designed to be deliberately confusing. Their labyrinthine quality is the result of what is known as agglutinative architecture. They were not built all at once according to a single master plan, but grew organically over centuries, with new wings, rooms and corridors being added on as the needs of the palace community changed. This process of gradual accretion created the complex, sprawling structures that Evans and his team uncovered. The role of the palaces as the economic centers of the Minoan state is made clear by the vast storage areas found within them. The western wing of the palace at Knossos is dominated by a series of long, narrow chambers known as the storage magazines. These rooms were filled with enormous pottery jars, known as pithoi, some of which were over 6 feet tall. These jars were used to store vast quantities of the state's agricultural wealth, olive oil, wine and grain. This was the central reserve of the kingdom, a testament to the palace's role as a center for the redistribution of goods, where the agricultural surplus was collected, stored, and then doled out to the artisans, priests, and administrators who served the state. The palaces were also major centers of craft production. They contained workshops where highly skilled artisans produced the luxury goods for which the Minoans were famous, the delicate, eggshell-thin Camorese ware pottery, beautifully carved stone vessels, and exquisite gold jewelry. The discovery of a large cache of elephant tusks and ingots of copper at the Palace of Zakros on the eastern coast confirms its role as a major port, directly involved in the import of raw materials from the east. This complex administrative and economic system was managed through the use of writing. The palaces were bureaucratic centers, and their administrators used the linear A script to keep detailed records. The thousands of clay tablets, roundels, and ceilings that have been found at Minoan sites are the administrative documents of the palace economy. While we cannot read the language, we can understand the function of these documents. They are inventories, lists of commodities, and records of transactions. They record the movement of goods into and out of the palace storerooms, the allocation of rations to workers, and the collection of taxes from the surrounding towns and villages. The Minoan palace was a highly organized and efficient machine for the management of a complex trade-based economy. It was from these magnificent, unfortified palace centers that the lords of the Minoan Thalassocracy ruled their peaceful and prosperous maritime empire for over 500 years. To enter the world of Minoan art is to enter a world of vibrant color, fluid movement, and a profound and joyful connection to the natural world. The art of the Minoans is perhaps their most captivating and most revealing legacy. It stands in stark and dramatic contrast to the artistic traditions of the other great civilizations of the ancient world. While the art of Egypt was predominantly foliary, formal, and focused on the static, eternal world of the gods and the afterlife, and the art of Mesopotamia was often a tool of state propaganda, celebrating the brutal military triumphs and the grim power of its kings, Minoan art was overwhelmingly concerned with life. It is an art of celebration, an exuberant expression of a culture that seems to have valued beauty, nature, and the dynamic energy of the living world above all else. From the magnificent frescoes that adorned the walls of their palaces, to their delicate pottery and their enigmatic figurines, their art is our most direct window into the Minoan soul, revealing a worldview that was unique, sophisticated, and filled with a remarkable sense of joy. The most spectacular expressions of Minoan art are the fresco paintings that decorated the walls of the great palaces, particularly at Knossos. Unlike the Egyptian technique of painting on a dry plaster surface, the Minoans mastered the art of true fresco, or buon fresco, in which the pigments were applied to a still wet lime plaster surface. As the plaster dried, the colors would chemically bond with the wall, creating a durable and brilliantly colored surface. The walls of the palaces were a riot of color, a vast canvas that depicted a world of ritual, nature, and elegant courtly life. The subjects of these frescoes reveal a deep and abiding fascination with the natural world. The famous dolphin fresco from the so-called Queen's Megaron at Knossos transforms the room into a vibrant underwater grotto. A school of dolphins leaps and plays amidst a swirl of fish and sea urchins, their bodies rendered with a fluid, graceful naturalism that captures the very essence of their movement. Other frescoes depict landscapes of rolling hills, sacred groves of olive trees, and river scenes with birds flitting through papyrus reeds. The Minoan artists were keen observers of nature, and they filled their palaces with images of the beautiful and dynamic world that surrounded them. Perhaps the most famous and most mysterious of all the Minoan frescoes is the bull-leaping fresco from Knossos. This remarkable painting depicts a central and clearly very important Minoan ritual. It shows a large, powerful, charging bull, its body elongated to emphasize its speed and power. 3 human figures, 2 light-skinned traditionally identified as female, and 1 dark-skinned traditionally identified as male, are shown interacting with the bull in a sequence of acrobatic movements. One figure at the front of the bull is grasping its horns, preparing for the leap. A second figure is shown in mid-air, in the midst of a perfect, graceful somersault over the bull's back. A third figure stands at the rear of the bull, with arms outstretched ready to catch the leaper. The scene is one of incredible energy, danger, and stylized grace. The meaning of this bull-leaping ritual is still hotly debated. Was it a religious ceremony, a rite of passage for young aristocrats, or a form of public entertainment? Whatever its precise function, the bull itself was clearly a central and powerful symbol in Minoan culture, a potent embodiment of natural strength, fertility, and divine power, which had to be confronted, controlled, and overcome in this dangerous and beautiful ritual dance. The frescoes also give us a vivid picture of the Minoan people themselves, particularly the elegant and seemingly powerful women of the court. The famous La Parisienne fresco, so named by Evans for its resemblance to a fashionable Parisian lady of his time, shows a young woman with a large, beautiful eye, an elaborate curled hairstyle, and a playfully upturned nose. The women in the frescoes are depicted with a freedom and a prominence that is unknown in the art of other ancient cultures. They are shown dressed in elaborate, colourful costumes with flounced skirts, tightly cinched waists, and most distinctively, fitted bodices that leave their breasts completely exposed. This was not a sign of immodesty, but was likely a ritual form of dress, perhaps connected to their role as priestesses in a fertility cult. Unlike in Athens, where women were confined to the home, Minoan women are shown as active participants in public life, sitting in the front rows at ceremonial events, and even participating in the dangerous bull-leaping ritual. This has led many to believe that women held a very high and possibly dominant status in Minoan society. This idea is reinforced by the evidence from their smaller, portable art, particularly their religious figurines. The most common and most powerful divine figure in Minoan art is not a male god, but a goddess. The most famous example is the faience, snake goddess figurine, discovered at Knossos. It depicts a powerful female figure with a wide skirt and a tight bodice, holding a writhing snake in each of her outstretched hands. A small feline sits perched on her elaborate headdress. She is a figure of immense power and authority. The snakes are ancient and potent symbols, connected to the earth, to fertility, to the underworld, and to the eternal cycle of death and rebirth through the shedding of their skin. This snake goddess was likely the primary deity of the Minoan pantheon, a great mother goddess who was the mistress of the animal world and the source of all life. The fact that the supreme deity of the Minoans appears to have been female, and that her primary attendants were priestesses, is a fundamental difference from the male-dominated pantheons of Greece, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. The Minoan love of nature and their skill as artists is also beautifully expressed in their pottery. The early Kamares ware from the Middle Minoan period is a delicate, eggshell-thin pottery, decorated with swirling, abstract, and often floral patterns in white, red, and orange on a black background. It is a masterpiece of abstract design. In the later period, the marine style became popular. The surface of the pot would be covered in beautifully rendered, naturalistic depictions of sea life. The famous octopus flask from Palacastro is a perfect example. A large, dynamic octopus wraps its tentacles around the entire body of the vessel, its form perfectly adapted to the shape of the pot, creating a sense of fluid, swirling motion. The artist has filled the empty spaces with other marine motifs, like seaweed, shells, and sea urchins, creating a complete and vibrant underwater world. The worldview that emerges from Minoan art is one of profound harmony between humanity and nature. It is a world that seems to be largely free from the themes of warfare, conquest, and brutal domination that are so common in the art of their contemporaries. Theirs is an art of joy, of ritual, of a deep appreciation for the beauty of the world around them. It is a peaceful, prosperous, and sophisticated world, a Bronze Age mirage of a golden age that seems almost too good to be true. But this joyful world was not to last. As we will see, it was a world that was living on borrowed time, its beautiful palaces and its life-affirming art destined for a sudden and catastrophic destruction. To understand the Minoans is to venture into a spiritual landscape that is both profoundly beautiful and deeply enigmatic. Their religion was not a religion of grand public temples or of heroic human-like gods whose squabbles and affairs were chronicled in epic poems. It was a more intimate, more mysterious, and more nature-focused system of belief, a world of sacred caves, mountaintop sanctuaries, and powerful female deities. The spiritual life of the Minoans was centered on the performance of complex rituals designed to maintain the harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine. While their unreadable script keeps the precise details of their theology a secret, their art, their architecture, and the archaeological remains of their sacred sites provide a rich tapestry of clues that allow us to reconstruct the outlines of their fascinating and unique religious world. The most striking feature of Minoan religion is the central role of the divine feminine. Unlike the patriarchal pantheons of their Indo-European and Semitic neighbors, where powerful male sky gods like Zeus or Marduk held supreme authority, the evidence from Minoan Crete points overwhelmingly to the worship of a great mother goddess. She appears in many forms throughout their art, as a powerful mistress of animals, as a warrior goddess with a sword, as a household goddess protecting the home, and most famously, as the enigmatic snake goddess. This powerful female deity, often depicted with exposed breasts, a flounced skirt, and snakes coiled around her arms, was likely the primary divinity of the Minoan pantheon, the great source of all life and fertility. The snakes she holds are potent and ancient symbols, connected to the earth, the underworld, the shedding of skin, and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. She represents the untamed power of nature itself, a force that is both life-giving and potentially dangerous. It seems likely that the Minoans saw their world as being governed by this powerful, all-encompassing female presence. Male gods certainly existed in the Minoan pantheon, but they appear to have played a subordinate role. A young male god, often depicted as a youthful, athletic figure, appears in some contexts, perhaps as the son or consort of the great goddess. He may be a dying and rising god, a figure whose life cycle is connected to the annual cycle of vegetation, similar to the Mesopotamian god Tammuz or the later Greek Adonis. But there is no evidence of a supreme male deity who ruled the cosmos. The central divine authority in the Minoan world was female, and this is reflected in the prominence of priestesses in their ritual scenes. While male priests existed, it is women who are most often depicted officiating at ceremonies, making offerings and leading religious processions. Minoan religion was a world where spiritual authority was largely in the hands of women. The places where the Minoans worshipped were also distinct. They did not build the kind of massive, separate temples that dominated the cities of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Instead, their religious activities were focused on three main types of locations: shrines within the palaces, sanctuaries on the peaks of mountains, and sacred caves deep within the earth. The palaces themselves were the most important religious centers. They contained numerous small shrines, lustral basins for purification rituals, and rooms with raised benches for the display of sacred objects. The great central courtyard of the palace was the primary stage for the major public religious festivals, such as the dangerous and acrobatic bull-leaping ritual. The palace was not just a political and economic center, it was a temple, the place where the human and divine worlds intersected most powerfully. Beyond the palaces, the Minoans revered the natural landscape and saw certain places as being imbued with divine power. They established sanctuaries on the peaks of many of the island's mountains, such as Mount Joktus, which overlooks the palace of Knossos. These were peak sanctuaries, open-air sites where the entire community would gather to make offerings to the gods. Pilgrims would climb the mountain and leave behind small votive offerings, usually clay figurines of humans, animals, and individual body parts that had been healed, as a form of prayer. From these high places they were literally closer to the heavens, and they could look down upon the fertile lands that the gods had provided. Caves were also seen as powerful and sacred places, portals to the underworld and the womb of the Earth Mother. Several caves on Crete, such as the Kamaris Cave and the Dictaean Cave, the legendary birthplace of Zeus in later Greek myth, were important centers of religious ritual for centuries. Offerings, including fine pottery and other precious objects, were left in the darkness of these caves, a tribute to the chthonic deities who resided there. The symbols of Minoan religion are everywhere in their art, but their exact meaning is often a puzzle. One of the most ubiquitous is the horns of consecration, a stylized representation of the horns of a bull. This symbol is found all over Minoan sites, on altars, on the roofs of shrines, and on seals and pottery. The bull itself was clearly an animal of immense religious importance, a powerful symbol of fertility, strength, and perhaps even the raw, untamed forces of nature. The bull-leaping frescoes, the bull head-shaped drinking vessels, or writer, and the stories of the Minotaur all point to the centrality of the bull in their ritual life. The bull-leaping ritual may have been a way of demonstrating human control and mastery over these powerful natural forces, a sacred dance with death that renewed the vitality of the community. Another key symbol is the labyrinth, the double-headed axe. Like the horns of consecration, images of the labyrinth are found everywhere, from giant ceremonial axes erected in the palace shrines to small, delicate gold pendants. The name Labyrinth itself may be related to the word Labyrinth, meaning the house of the double axe. This symbol has been interpreted in many ways, as a sacrificial tool, as a symbol of the thunder god, or, most compellingly, as the primary symbol of the great mother goddess herself. In many cultures, the butterfly with its transformative life cycle is a symbol of the soul, and the shape of the double axe closely resembles that of a stylized butterfly. The The Minoan religious calendar was likely marked by a series of great seasonal festivals, designed to ensure the fertility of the crops and the well-being of the community. Processional frescoes from Knossos show long lines of elegantly dressed men and women carrying offerings, moving towards a sacred destination. These festivals would have been joyous and vibrant occasions, filled with music, dance, and feasting. The art of the Minoans is an art of celebration, and it reflects a religious worldview that was deeply connected to the joyful and life-affirming aspects of the natural world. However, there is also a darker and more controversial side to Minoan religion: the question of human sacrifice. For a long time, the peaceful and joyful image of the Minoans, as promoted by Arthur Evans, made the idea of human sacrifice seem impossible. Evans himself dismissed any evidence he found that might point in this direction. But in the late 1970s, the archaeologist Peter Warren excavated a site at Anemospilia, on the slopes of Mount Ioctus, that provided chilling and undeniable evidence. He found the ruins of a small, isolated temple that had been destroyed by a massive earthquake and fire around 1700 BCE. Inside, he found the remains of 4 individuals. 3 of them appeared to be priests or priestesses. The 4th was a young man lying on his side on a raised platform or altar, his legs bent in a way that suggested they had been bound. Most tellingly, a magnificent decorated bronze dagger was found lying on top of his skeleton. The evidence strongly suggests that at the very moment the great earthquake struck, the Minoan priests were in the process of sacrificing this young man, perhaps in a desperate last-ditch attempt to appease the angry gods who were shaking their world apart. Further evidence has since come to light at other sites, including a sanctuary at Fornu Coryphae, where the bones of children were found, seemingly butchered and cooked in a ritual context. While this practice was likely rare, perhaps reserved for moments of extreme crisis, it reveals a darker and more terrifying side to the Minoan soul. It shows that for all their love of nature and beauty, they, like many other ancient peoples, believed that the ultimate offering to the gods was a human life. The Minoan spiritual world was a complex tapestry of light and shadow, of joyful celebration and profound, terrifying awe. It was a world where the goddess could appear in a sacred tree, where men could dance with bulls, and where in moments of ultimate desperation, a human heart could be offered to the gods to preserve the harmony of the cosmos. The great palaces of Minoan Crete, with their sprawling layouts, their vast storage capacities, and their sophisticated administrative systems, are the most powerful and visible evidence of a complex and highly organized state. For centuries, these palace centers were the hubs of a prosperous and stable civilization that dominated the Aegean. But who ruled this civilization, and how was it governed? This is one of the most fundamental and most debated questions in Minoan archaeology. The absence of the kind of overt, monumental propaganda that we see in Egypt and Mesopotamia makes the Minoan political landscape a challenging one to reconstruct. There are no colossal statues of kings, no victory stelae boasting of military conquests, and our inability to read their linear A script means that their own words about their system of government remain silent. However, by carefully piecing together the clues from the architecture, the art, and the administrative documents, we can begin to sketch a portrait of a unique and sophisticated political system, a world that may have been governed not by a single, all-powerful king, but by a collective elite, perhaps even one in which women held a significant share of power. The early excavator of Knossos, Sir Arthur Evans, was a man of his time, a product of the Victorian era with its great monarchies and empires. When he uncovered the Great Palace, he naturally interpreted it through this lens. He identified a specific room as the throne room, centered on a magnificent high-backed gypsum throne that is still in place today. He identified a relief fragment of a priest-like figure as the priest-king of Knossos. For Evans, the Minoan world was a monarchy, ruled by a powerful dynasty of kings, the legendary dynasty of Minos, who resided in this great palace and ruled over the entire island. This model of a centralized monarchical state with Knossos as its capital was the orthodox view for many decades. The throne room at Knossos is indeed a remarkable space. It is a small, intimate chamber, with gypsum benches lining the walls. The throne itself is flanked by magnificent frescoes of griffins, mythical creatures with the body of a lion and the head of an eagle, who were the traditional guardians of royalty in the ancient Near East. However, modern archaeologists have begun to question Evans's interpretation. They point out that the throne room is relatively small and could not have accommodated a large public audience. More importantly, they argue that its features, particularly the lostral basin sunk into the floor in an adjoining antechamber, suggest that its primary function was not political, but religious. The throne may not have been the seat of a human king, but a ritual seat, left empty for a deity, perhaps the great mother goddess, who would be invisibly present during the ceremonies performed there. The person who did sit on the throne may have been a high priestess, the earthly representative of the goddess, rather than a male king. This questioning of the traditional model has led to a number of alternative theories about Minoan governance. One possibility is that the island was not a single unified state, but a collection of independent palace states, each controlling its own territory. In this model, the rulers of Knossos, Phaistos, Malaya and Zakros would have been independent sovereigns, perhaps linked by a loose confederation, similar to the city-state model of the later Greeks. The greater size and wealth of Knossos may suggest that it was the most powerful of these states, a first among equals, but not the absolute ruler of the entire island. This model would help to explain the distinct architectural styles and the unique seal impressions found at each of the different palace sites. Even within each palace state, the nature of the ruler is a mystery. The overwhelming prominence of female figures in religious art, particularly the powerful snake goddess and her priestesses, has led some scholars to propose a radical and controversial theory that Minoan Crete was a theocracy ruled by a line of priestess queens. In this matriarchal model, the supreme power would have been held by women, who were the chief intermediaries with the great goddess. Male figures, if they were kings, would have held a subordinate, consort-like role. This theory is supported by the high status and public prominence of women in the frescoes, and the general absence of male figures in positions of supreme authority. While a full-fledged matriarchy is considered unlikely by most scholars today, the evidence strongly suggests that women of the elite class held a level of religious and political power that was unparalleled in the ancient world. Another compelling possibility is that the Minoan palaces were not ruled by a single monarch at all, but by a collective elite, a form of oligarchy. The rulers may have been a council of the heads of the most powerful aristocratic families or clans, who governed the state by consensus. This model of collective rule would fit well with the anonymous, impersonal nature of Minoan art and architecture. The palaces were vast and complex, but they lack a single dominant monumental royal residence. Instead, they seem to be composed of a series of elite residential units. This might suggest that power was shared among a group of nobles, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a single king. This would also explain the absence of royal portraits and laudatory inscriptions. If power was collective, then the glorification of an individual would have been seen as a dangerous and destabilizing act. Whatever the precise form of their government, it is clear that the rulers who operated from the palaces wielded immense economic and administrative power. The palaces were the centers of a highly organized, redistributive economy. The vast storage magazines, with their giant pithoi jars, show that the palace administration was responsible for collecting the agricultural surplus of the entire region, the oil, wine, and grain. This surplus was then used to support the large population of non-agricultural specialists who lived and worked in the palace, the artisans, the scribes, the priests, and the administrators themselves. The discovery of the Linear A archives at sites like Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros has provided a direct, if unreadable, window into this complex bureaucracy. The clay tablets are meticulous administrative records. They are lists of commodities, inventories of goods, and records of personnel. They record the allocation of rations, the collection of taxes likely in the form of agricultural produce, and the movement of goods into and out of the palace storerooms. This was a highly literate and numerate bureaucracy, capable of managing a complex state-controlled economy with great efficiency. The use of finely carved stone seals to impress clay ceilings on jars and storeroom doors was a key part of this administrative control, a way of marking ownership and securing the state's valuable resources. The rulers of the palaces also controlled the production and export of the luxury goods that were the basis of Minoan international trade. The palace workshops were centers of excellence, producing the finest pottery, the most beautifully carved stone vessels, and the most exquisite jewelry. The state likely held a monopoly on this lucrative export trade, which brought in the essential raw materials like copper, tin, gold, and ivory that were not available on the island. The wealth and power of the Minoan elite was built on their control of both agricultural production at home and long-distance trade abroad. The Minoan political system, for all its mysteries, was remarkably successful and stable for over 500 years. The Pax Minoica, the long period of peace and prosperity, is a testament to the effectiveness of their form of government. Whether ruled by a king, a priestess queen, or a council of nobles, the Minoan state was able to maintain internal order, to foster a vibrant and prosperous economy, and to project its power and influence across the seas, all without the need for massive armies or fortified cities. It was a unique and sophisticated political experiment, a world that may have valued collective harmony and economic prosperity over the glorification of the individual warrior king. But this peaceful and stable world was built on a fragile foundation, and as we will see, it was destined to be shattered by a combination of natural disaster and foreign invasion. For over 500 years, the Minoan civilization had flourished in an atmosphere of unparalleled peace and security. Their unfortified palaces grew ever larger and more magnificent. Their art became more vibrant and sophisticated, and their ships sailed the Aegean with an assurance born of their undisputed mastery of the seas. But this golden age, this Pax Minoica, was not to last. Sometime in the late Bronze Age, the Minoan world was rocked by a cataclysm of almost unimaginable scale. A natural disaster so powerful that its effects were felt across the entire eastern Mediterranean, and its memory may have been preserved in legends for thousands of years. This was the great volcanic eruption of Thera, the island known today as Santorini. The Theran cataclysm was a turning point in the history of the Aegean, a devastating blow that, while it may not have been the single direct cause of the Minoan collapse, certainly weakened the great civilization, leaving it vulnerable to the final fatal blow of foreign invasion. The island of Thera is located about 70 miles north of Crete, a part of the Cycladic island chain. In the Minoan period, it was a large, round island, with a flourishing and sophisticated port city on its southern coast, at a site now known as Akrotiri. The people of Akrotiri were not Minoans, but they were deeply influenced by Minoan culture. Their houses were multi-storied structures. Their walls were decorated with magnificent frescoes in a pure Minoan style, and they used the Minoan Linear A script. Akrotiri was a prosperous and important outpost of the Minoan cultural and economic world. Sometime in the 17th or late 16th century BCE, the precise dating is still a subject of intense scholarly debate. The volcano at the center of the island of Thera exploded in one of the largest and most violent eruptions in all of human history. The eruption was of a colossal scale, with a volcanic explosivity index estimated at 6 or 7, making it many times more powerful than the famous eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. The eruption occurred in several phases. It began with a series of earthquakes and a preliminary fall of pumice, which gave the inhabitants of Akrotiri a warning. The archaeological evidence from the site is remarkable. The city was not destroyed in a sudden Pompeii-like disaster. There are no human remains found in the ruins. The people of Akrotiri, warned by the initial tremors, had time to gather their most valuable possessions and to evacuate the island in an orderly fashion. The city they left behind was buried, and perfectly preserved, under a layer of ash over 100 feet deep. The main phase of the eruption was a cataclysmic Plinian eruption, which sent a colossal column of ash, gas, and rock tens of miles high into the stratosphere. This massive ash cloud would have blotted out the sun, plunging the entire Aegean region into a period of prolonged darkness. As the eruption column collapsed, it generated a series of pyroclastic flows, superheated, fast-moving clouds of ash and gas that surged across the sea, incinerating everything in their path. The final and most devastating event was the collapse of the volcano's magma chamber, which caused the entire center of the island of Thera to implode, forming the massive, sea-filled caldera that we see today. The collapse of the caldera would have displaced an enormous volume of seawater, generating a series of colossal tsunamis. These giant waves, possibly hundreds of feet high, would have radiated outwards across the Aegean at the speed of a modern jetliner. For the island of Crete, lying just 70 miles to the south, the impact would have been catastrophic. The great waves would have slammed into the northern and eastern coasts of the island, where many of the most important Minoan port cities and coastal settlements were located. The entire Minoan fleet, the very basis of their thalassocratic power, whether it was in harbour or at sea, would have been completely annihilated. The coastal towns, the shipyards and the warehouses would have been obliterated, and the fertile coastal plains would have been inundated with salt water and debris. Archaeological evidence from sites on the coast of Crete, such as the palace at Zakros and the town of Palakastro, shows clear signs of a massive destruction event, with buildings smashed and debris carried far inland, consistent with the impact of a massive tsunami. The long-term environmental consequences of the eruption would have been just as devastating. The massive cloud of volcanic ash would have been carried by the prevailing winds southwards, directly over eastern and central Crete. This ashfall would have covered the agricultural lands with a thick layer of acidic ash, poisoning the soil, destroying crops, and ruining pastures for years to come. The fine ash would have contaminated drinking water sources and could have caused widespread respiratory problems for both humans and livestock. The climate of the entire northern hemisphere would have been affected, as the stratospheric ash cloud would have partially blocked out the sun, leading to a period of global cooling and several years of failed harvests. Ice cores from as far away as Greenland have shown evidence of a major acid spike corresponding to the time of the Theran eruption, a testament to its global impact. For the Minoan civilization, the Theran cataclysm would have been a blow of almost apocalyptic proportions. It would have been a simultaneous economic, environmental, and psychological disaster. Their powerful fleet, the source of their wealth and their security, would have been destroyed. Their rich coastal plains, a key source of their food, would have been ruined. And the sudden terrifying darkness that blotted out the sun, the tsunamis that roared from the sea, and the ash that rained down from the sky, would have been interpreted as a sign of the ultimate wrath of the gods. The very foundations of their stable and harmonious world would have been shattered. For many years, the Theran eruption was seen by scholars as the single decisive cause of the collapse of the Minoan civilization. The great palaces, it was believed, were all destroyed in this one massive event. However, as archaeological dating techniques have become more precise, a more complex picture has emerged. It now seems that while the eruption was a devastating blow, it was not the final one. The archaeological evidence suggests that the final fiery destruction of the great palaces at Knossos, Phaistos and Malea occurred several decades, perhaps even a century, after the Theran eruption. The Minoans, it seems, survived the cataclysm, at least for a time. They may have managed to rebuild their fleet and to restore a semblance of their former prosperity, but they would have been a deeply wounded and weakened civilization. Their economy would have been crippled, their population may have been reduced, and their self-confidence and their faith in the old order would have been profoundly shaken. They were now a vulnerable power. It was in this weakened and traumatized state that they would have to face a new and rising threat from the north. The ambitious and warlike Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The Theran cataclysm did not kill the Minoan civilization, but it inflicted a mortal wound. The earth shook, the sea roared, and the sun vanished from the sky, and in the terrifying aftermath of this great natural disaster, the stage was set for the final human act of the Minoan tragedy. The great Theran cataclysm had shattered the Minoan world, but it had not completely destroyed it. In the decades that followed the eruption, the resilient Minoans appear to have picked up the pieces, to have rebuilt their coastal settlements, and to have tried to restore their maritime empire to its former glory. But they were a shadow of their former selves, a civilization that was economically weakened, demographically reduced, and ideologically shaken to its core. The Pax Minoica, the long era of peace and security that had been guaranteed by their unrivaled fleet, was over. In this new, more dangerous world, The weakened Minoans would have to face a new and formidable power that was rising on the Greek mainland, a culture that had learned much from the Minoans, but which possessed a very different, more aggressive, and more militaristic spirit. These were the Mycenaeans, the first Greek-speaking peoples to build a major civilization, and their growing shadow would soon fall over Crete, bringing the long and brilliant history of the independent Minoan civilization to a final and violent end. The Mycenaeans were a culture of warrior kings who dominated mainland Greece from about 1600 to 1100 BCE. Their centers of power were not the open, unfortified palaces of the Minoans, but heavily fortified citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. They were a martial aristocracy, whose art is filled with scenes of warfare and hunting, and whose graves are filled with weapons of war, bronze swords, spears, and iconic boar's tusk helmets. For centuries, the Mycenaeans had been on the periphery of the Minoan world. They were the junior partners, the provincials who eagerly imported the sophisticated luxury goods, the artistic styles, and the administrative technologies of the more advanced Minoan civilization. They learned to write their own early form of the Greek language using a script, Linear B, which was a direct adaptation of the Minoan Linear A. But as Minoan power waned in the aftermath of the Theran eruption, the balance of power in the Aegean began to shift dramatically. The Mycenaeans, with their strong military traditions and their growing ambitions, saw their opportunity. They began to expand their own trade networks and to project their power across the sea. The students were now ready to challenge and to overthrow their former masters. Sometime around 1450 BCE, a decisive and dramatic change occurred on the island of Crete. At the great palace of Knossos, a new ruling power seems to have taken control. The archaeological evidence for this takeover is clear and compelling. A new and distinctly Mycenaean style of pottery, known as palace style, appears at the site. The artistic motifs on the frescoes and seals become more rigid, more formal, and more militaristic, incorporating Mycenaean themes like the figure-eight shield. The burial customs also change, with the appearance of Mycenaean-style warrior graves, where the deceased are buried with a full set of bronze weapons. But the most definitive and irrefutable piece of evidence comes from the palace archives. The final archive of clay tablets found in the ruins of the palace at Knossos. The tablets that were accidentally baked and preserved in the fire that finally destroyed the building are not written in the Minoan Linear A script. They are written in Linear B. The decipherment of Linear B in the 1950s by Michael Ventris was a revolutionary moment. It proved that the language of these final tablets was an early form of Greek. The conclusion was inescapable. In its final phase, the great palace of Minos at Knossos was being administered by Greek-speaking Mycenaeans. The exact nature of this Mycenaean takeover is still debated. Was it a full-scale military invasion, a violent conquest that saw a Mycenaean army land on Crete and storm the palace of Knossos? Or was it a more gradual process, perhaps a dynastic marriage, or even a coup led by a local faction that was supported by Mycenaean mercenaries? Some scholars have even proposed that the takeover may have been relatively peaceful, with the weakened Minoan elite inviting a Mycenaean warlord and his followers to take control of the palace to help restore order. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was a profound cultural transformation. A new Greek-speaking warrior aristocracy was now in control of the most important center on the island. They seem to have ruled from Knossos for several generations, adapting the sophisticated Minoan administrative system to their own needs. The Linear B tablets from Knossos are very similar to those found on the mainland at Pylos and Mycenae. They are meticulous but mundane administrative records, inventories of the palace storerooms that list vast quantities of sheep, wool, chariots, and weapons. They paint a picture of a highly centralized, bureaucratic, and militarized state, ruled by a king or one-axe, who controlled the economic life of the kingdom. This period of Mycenaean rule at Knossos seems to have been a prosperous one, but it was also a period of cultural change. The old, vibrant, life-affirming spirit of Minoan art was replaced by the more rigid, formal, and martial spirit of the Mycenaeans. The island of Crete was now integrated into the wider Mycenaean world. The cause of this final destruction is another great mystery. Who burned Knossos? One theory is that it was the result of an internal uprising by the native Minoan population, a massive rebellion to overthrow their foreign Mycenaean overlords. In this scenario, the Minoans, after generations of subjugation, finally rose up and destroyed the symbol of their oppression. Another theory suggests the opposite, that the final destruction was the work of a new wave of invaders from the Greek mainland, perhaps a rival Mycenaean kingdom that sought to eliminate Knossos as a commercial competitor. A third possibility points to natural causes, such as another major earthquake, a disaster to which the island is prone. Whatever the cause, the destruction of Knossos in the early 14th century BCE marked the end of an era. With the collapse of the last great palace centre, the sophisticated Bronze Age civilization of Crete effectively came to an end. The island entered a long period of decline and relative poverty. The skills of the fresco painters, the stone vase carvers, and the master builders were lost. The art of writing disappeared from the island for several hundred years. Crete became a cultural backwater, a shadow of its former glorious self. The Minoan civilization, Europe's first great experiment in urban literate life, was over, but it was not entirely forgotten. Its memory was preserved in the powerful Greek myths of King Minos, the Labyrinth, and the Minotaur, distant, distorted echoes of its former greatness. Its artistic and cultural innovations were absorbed by the Mycenaeans and became a foundational part of the later Greek world. The Minoans were the brilliant, enigmatic, and ultimately tragic first great civilization of Europe. They created a world of unique beauty, of peaceful prosperity, and of joyful celebration. It was a world that was shattered by a combination of natural disaster and human aggression, leaving behind only the haunting ruins of its magnificent palaces and the undeciphered secrets of its lost language. The shadow of the Mycenaean warriors had fallen over the island of the goddess, and the light of Europe's first civilization had been extinguished. Of all the profound mysteries that shroud the Minoan world, none is more central, more tantalizing, or more fundamental to their enigma than their language. To stand before a Minoan inscription is to experience a unique form of historical vertigo. We can see their words, we can often read their letters, and we can even understand their numbering system, yet we can barely comprehend what they were trying to say. The Minoans were the first literate civilization in Europe, and they left behind thousands of texts, a substantial corpus for an ancient people. But this vast collection of words remains largely silent, a voice from the past that we can hear as a whisper, but whose meaning we cannot grasp. The decipherment of the Minoan language is the holy grail of Aegean archaeology, a linguistic puzzle that has stumped the most brilliant scholarly minds for over a century. The story of this lost language, its unique nature, the different scripts that recorded it, the texts that have survived, and our painstaking efforts to read them, is the story of the final translucent veil that separates us from the minds of the Minoans. It is the ultimate secret that they, perhaps unintentionally, managed to keep from their Mycenaean conquerors and from us. The great quest to understand the Minoan language began with the man who discovered the civilization itself, Sir Arthur Evans. His initial motivation for travelling to Crete was not to find a lost palace, but to find the source of the small, beautifully engraved seal stones he had seen in the antique shops of Athens. These milkstones, as the Cretan women who wore them as amulets called them, were covered in a mysterious pictographic script that he was convinced was a form of pre-Greek writing. His obsession was justified. When he began his excavations at Knossos, he not only found the magnificent palace, but also its archives, thousands of clay tablets that confirm the existence of not just one, but three distinct sequential writing systems on Crete. The earliest of these, which Evans named Cretan hieroglyphic, was in use from about 2100 to 1700 BCE. This was a primarily pictographic script, where the signs were recognizable, if stylized, images of objects from the Minoan world. Human figures, parts of the body, animals, plants, ships, and weapons. It is found mostly on the small seal stones that first drew Evans to Crete, and on clay administrative documents like bars and labels. While pictographic, it was not a simple one-to-one system of picture writing. The approximately 140 known signs likely represented a combination of whole words, logograms and syllablograms. The famous and still unique Phaistos disc, which we will return to, was created using a related, though not identical, hieroglyphic script. Around 1800 BCE, a new and more efficient script emerged, which Evans named Linear A. This script was a significant evolution. While it likely developed from the earlier hieroglyphs, its signs were now much more abstract and linear, better suited for being quickly incised onto a wet clay tablet with a stylus. Linear A was the primary administrative script of the great Minoan palace civilization during its golden age, from about 1800 to 1450 BCE. Over 1,500 examples of Linear A have been found, not just at Knossos but at palaces and villas all across Crete, and even at Minoan sites in the Aegean islands like Theran and Milos. This was the true language of the Minoans. The third script discovered at Knossos was Linear B. It was found only in the final destruction layer of the palace, dating to around 1375 BCE. While it clearly evolved from Linear A, using many of the same signs, Evans recognized it as a distinct and more orderly script. Evans spent the last decades of his life trying to decipher all three scripts, but he was hampered by one powerful and ultimately incorrect conviction. He believed that the underlying language of all the Cretan scripts was a single, mysterious, non-Greek language he called Minoan. He steadfastly refused to entertain the possibility that any of the scripts could represent the Greek language, which he believed had not arrived in the Aegean until much later. This idée fixe would prevent him from ever cracking the code. The great breakthrough came not from a seasoned professor, but from a brilliant young English architect and amateur linguist named Michael Ventris. Ventris had been fascinated by Linear B since he was a schoolboy, after hearing a lecture by the elderly Arthur Evans. He dedicated his life to the problem, and in the early 1950s, using a systematic, code-breaking approach, he made one of the greatest intellectual leaps of the 20th century. Working on the assumption that many of the place names mentioned in the Linear B tablets from Knossos might be the same as the ancient place names of Crete, he was able to assign phonetic values to many of the syllabic signs. He then took a crucial step. On a hunch, he tried applying these phonetic values to the words to see if they would form a known language. The language that emerged, to his astonishment and initial disbelief, was an archaic Bronze Age form of ancient Greek. In 1952 he published his findings, and with the collaboration of the Cambridge classicist John Chadwick, the decipherment was confirmed. The world of the Mycenaeans, the heroes of Homer, could now be read in their own words. The decipherment of Linear B was a revolutionary moment. It pushed back the history of the Greek language by 700 years, and provided an invaluable, if limited, window into the administration of the Mycenaean palaces. But it had an equally profound impact on Minoan studies. It proved definitively that the rulers of Knossos in its final days were Greek-speaking Mycenaeans. It also proved, by extension, that the earlier Linear A script, the true script of the Minoans, was not Greek. The two scripts use many of the same symbols, but when the phonetic values from Linear B are applied to Linear A, the resulting words are gibberish. They do not form a recognizable language. Ventris had unlocked the language of the conquerors, but the language of the Minoans themselves slipped back into silence. Its mystery deepened. So what do we know about the silent language of Linear A? We know its function. The thousands of surviving texts are almost exclusively administrative records. They are lists, inventories, and accounts. The clay tablets typically record a logogram, a picture of the commodity such as a wine jar, a wheat stalk, or a chariot, followed by a number. The Minoan numbering system was a simple decimal system, with vertical lines for ones, horizontal lines for tens, circles for hundreds, and a circle with rays for 1,000. We can read these lists. We can tell that a specific palace official recorded the transfer of 100 jars of olive oil to a particular destination. We can see the meticulous bureaucracy of the palace economy at work. But the words that accompany these lists, the names of the officials, the place names, the verbs for give or receive, their meaning can only be guessed at. The most famous and most frustrating of all Minoan texts is the Phaistos discode. discovered in 1908 at the Palace of Phonistos. It is a small, flat disc of fired clay, about 6 inches in diameter, and it is unlike any other artifact ever found. Both sides of the disc are covered in a spiral of hieroglyphic signs. What is unique is that the signs were not incised by hand, but were stamped into the wet clay with individual punches or seals, making it the world's first known example of printing with movable type. The script contains 242 signs in total, comprising 45 unique symbols. The signs are arranged in groups, separated by vertical lines, suggesting they form words. The spiral, which runs from the outside in, seems to tell a story or a sequence, but what does it say? The Phaistos disc is a hapax legomenon, a thing said only once, with no other examples of this specific script, and with no bilingual key. It is completely undecipherable. Theories about its meaning range from a hymn to a goddess, to a magical incantation, a list of soldiers, a geometric theorem, or even a board game. Some have even suggested it is a clever modern forgery, though most scholars accept its authenticity. The Phaistos disc is a perfect symbol of the Minoan enigma, a work of incredible sophistication and beauty that keeps its secrets absolutely. The quest to decipher Linear A continues. Scholars have tried to connect the underlying Minoan language to other known language families. The most promising, though still highly controversial, link is to the Anatolian language family, specifically Luwian. This would provide a tantalizing link back to Herodotus's old story of a Lydian origin for the people of the region. Other theories have proposed connections to Semitic languages, or to other, now lost pre-Indo-European languages of the Mediterranean. But without the discovery of a long text or a bilingual key, these theories remain speculative. The lost language of the Minoans is the final barrier between us and them. It is what keeps them shrouded in a beautiful and impenetrable mist of enigma. We can see their world through the vibrant, joyful art of their frescoes. We can analyze the structure of their society through the ruins of their magnificent palaces and the contents of their graves. We can understand their influence on the Mycenaeans who conquered them. But until we can read their words, until we can understand the names they gave to their gods, their kings and their cities, we will never truly be able to enter their minds. Their language is the ultimate symbol of their fate, a culture whose voice was so completely silenced by the passage of time and the triumph of their successors that even when we find their words written in clay and preserved by fire, we can no longer understand what they have to say. At the very heart of the Minoan mystery, in the center of the legendary Labyrinth, we find not the mythical Minotaur, but a scene of breathtaking beauty, energy, and almost unimaginable danger. It is the ritual of bull leaping, the most iconic and most enigmatic of all Minoan activities. Depicted in frescoes, on seals, and in bronze and ivory figurines, this spectacular and perilous performance was clearly a central and defining feature of Minoan culture. The image of a graceful, athletic youth somersaulting over the back of a charging bull is the ultimate symbol of the Minoan spirit, a culture that did not fear the raw, untamed power of nature, but chose instead to engage with it in a deadly and beautiful dance. The bull-leaping ritual was a masterpiece of sacred theatre, a spectacle that combined the elements of a religious ceremony, a rite of passage, and a death-defying extreme sport, and its secrets provide one of our most direct insights into the Minoan worldview. Our most complete and famous depiction of this ritual is the magnificent bull-leaping fresco from the Palace of Knossos. This restored panel, which once decorated a wall in the east wing of the palace, is a masterpiece of Minoan art, a symphony of colour and motion. It depicts a huge, powerful bull, its body elongated and stylized to emphasize its speed and immense power, charging across a stark blue background. The bull is surrounded by 3 human figures, their bodies lithe and athletic, their waists cinched in the typical Minoan fashion. The figures are differentiated by color, a common convention in Aegean art. 2 of the figures are painted white, traditionally identified as female, while the central figure is painted a reddish-brown, identified as male. These 3 figures appear to be engaged in a sequential 3-part performance. On the left, a white-skinned figure stands in front of the charging bull, grasping its powerful horns as if to initiate the leap. In the center, the dark-skinned male figure is shown in mid-air, in the midst of a perfect, graceful, backward somersault over the bull's back, his long, dark hair flying. On the right, another white-skinned figure stands with arms outstretched, seemingly ready to catch the leaper as he lands. The entire scene is one of incredible dynamism, precision, and stylized grace, a moment of high drama frozen in time. The centrality of the bull in Minoan culture is undeniable. The bull was the most powerful and formidable animal in their world, a potent symbol of natural strength, virility, and fertility. Its thunderous bellow and the ground-shaking force of its charge may also have been associated with the frequent earthquakes that shook the island of Crete. This powerful, awe-inspiring creature appears everywhere in Minoan art. We see it on seals and in frescoes, and magnificent, life-sized bull-head-shaped drinking vessels, or rita, have been found at Knossos and Zakros, their eyes of inlaid crystal and their horns of gilded wood. The most common architectural and religious symbol found at Minoan sites is the horns of Consecration, a stylized representation of a pair of bull's horns, which were placed on altars and on the roofs of shrines. And of course the enduring Greek myth of the Minotaur, the monstrous bull man who lived at the heart of the labyrinth, is a powerful, if distorted, memory of the bull's sacred and terrifying status in Minoan Crete. The bull-leaping ritual was the ultimate expression of this cultural obsession. But how was it actually performed? The acrobatics depicted in the fresco seem almost impossible, a feat that would challenge the most skilled modern gymnasts and rodeo clowns. One of the great debates among scholars is how to interpret the fresco. Is it a realistic, if stylized, depiction of the leap? The flying leap, as depicted, would require the leaper to grab the horns of a charging bull, use the upward toss of the bull's head to propel himself into a somersault, push off the bull's back, and then land on the ground behind it. The level of speed, strength, timing, and sheer courage required for such a maneuver is almost beyond comprehension. Some scholars have proposed alternative, more plausible interpretations. One theory is that the fresco does not depict a single continuous leap, but three different individuals performing three different roles in the ritual: the horn grappler at the front, the leaper in the middle, and the catcher at the back. Another theory, proposed by the archaeologist and experimental historian John Younger, suggests that the leapers would approach the bull from the side. They would run alongside the bull, place their hands on its back, and then vault sideways over the animal in a graceful acrobatic display, a form of ancient bull vaulting. This would have been less suicidal than the head-on, horn-grappling approach, but would still have been an incredibly dangerous and skillful performance. Whatever the precise mechanics of the leap, its purpose was clearly far more than simple entertainment. It was a deeply symbolic and ritualized event. What was the meaning of this sacred dance with death? One interpretation is that it was a religious ceremony, a sacred spectacle performed in the great central courtyards of the palaces during major religious festivals. The bull may have been a sacrificial animal, and the ritual itself may have been a way of sanctifying the bull before its death. The ritual may also have been a reenactment of a mythological event, a story from the Minoan sacred texts that is now lost to us. Another powerful theory is that bull leaping was a rite of passage for the young men and women of the Minoan aristocracy. By successfully confronting and mastering the powerful and dangerous bull, they would demonstrate their courage, their skill, and their fitness to become members of the ruling elite. The fact that the frescoes and figurines often depict both male and female leapers is a revolutionary and startling detail. In the rigidly patriarchal world of ancient Greece, the idea of young women participating in such a dangerous public spectacle would have been unthinkable. The presence of female bull leapers is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the high status and public role of women in Minoan society. The ritual can also be seen as a great cosmic metaphor. The bull, as a symbol of the raw, untamed, and often destructive forces of nature, like earthquakes and storms, is confronted by the human figures, who represent civilization, order, and skill. The successful completion of the leap is a symbolic victory of human culture over the chaos of nature. It is a ritual that demonstrates and reaffirms the Minoan ability to control their world, to live in harmony with the powerful forces of nature, but also to master them through their skill, and their grace. It is a powerful statement of the Minoan worldview, a celebration of life in the face of ever-present danger. The bull-leaping ritual was not just confined to Crete. Frescoes depicting the same scene have been found at the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, at Tel el-Dubba in the Nile Delta of Egypt, and in Anatolia. This suggests that the ritual, or at least the spectacle of it, was an internationally recognized and prestigious event. It is possible that teams of Minoan bull leapers traveled the Mediterranean, performing at the courts of foreign kings, much like the traveling acrobats and athletes of later eras. The Greek myth of the Athenian youths and maidens being sent to Crete as tribute for the Minotaur may be a distant and distorted memory of this very practice, a memory of a time when the great powers of the Aegean were required to send their own young nobles to the court of Minos to be trained in the dangerous art of the bull leapers. The bull leapers of Knossos are the ultimate symbol of the Minoan enigma. They represent a world of incredible artistic achievement, of sophisticated ritual, and of a relationship with the natural world that was both reverent and daring. The image of the graceful youth, suspended in mid-air over the back of a charging bull, is a perfect metaphor for the Minoan civilization itself, a culture of breathtaking grace and elegance that was living out a precarious and beautiful existence, balanced on the knife edge of the powerful and unpredictable forces that would ultimately bring its world to a sudden and catastrophic end. One of the most profound and defining characteristics of the Minoan civilization, and the one that sets it most dramatically apart from its contemporaries, is a striking and conspicuous absence. When we look at the great palace centers of Knossos, Phaistos and Malea, we find no great defensive walls, no massive fortifications, no heavily guarded gateways. This is in stark and absolute contrast to the other great civilizations of the Bronze Age. The city-states of Mesopotamia were enclosed by colossal brick walls. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was a marvel of defensive engineering, a near-impregnable mountain fortress. And the Mycenaean Greeks, the Minoans' own neighbors on the mainland, built their palaces as heavily fortified citadels, surrounded by immense cyclopean walls that were designed to withstand a brutal siege. The Minoan palaces, by contrast, were open, sprawling, and seemingly undefended. This remarkable lack of fortifications is the primary evidence for one of the most compelling and romantic ideas about the Minoans, that they were a uniquely peaceful civilization, a society that had for centuries managed to create a world without war. This was the Pax Minoica, the Minoan peace, a golden age of security and prosperity that was unlike anything else in the ancient world. The foundation of this long peace was the Minoans' mastery of the sea. Their power was that of a Thalassocracy, a maritime empire, and their primary defense was not a wall of stone but a wall of wood, their powerful and ever-present fleet. The geography of Crete, a large and mountainous island, made it a natural fortress. Any potential invader would have to mount a major amphibious assault, a notoriously difficult and risky military operation. The Minoan fleet, which patrolled the Aegean Sea, was designed to ensure that no such assault could ever reach the shores of Crete. They controlled the sea lanes, and by doing so they could deter any potential enemy long before they became a threat. The Greek historian Thucydides, writing 1,000 years later but likely drawing on ancient traditions, preserved a memory of this Minoan naval power. He wrote that the legendary King Minos was the first person to organize a navy, and he had control of most of the Hellenic Sea. He ruled over the Cyclades, and he cleared the sea of pirates, so that he could better secure his own revenues. For centuries, the Minoan fleet was the ultimate guarantor of their security, a floating fortification that made city walls unnecessary. This sense of security and openness is reflected in the very architecture of their palaces. The palaces are not designed for defense. They are sprawling, agglutinative structures, with multiple entrances and a complex layout of open courtyards, light wells and grand staircases. They are built for comfort, for ceremony, and for the efficient administration of their commercial empire, not for withstanding a siege. The great central courtyard, the heart of every palace, was an open and accessible public space, the stage for the great festivals and rituals that brought the community together. This architecture speaks of a society that was confident, outward-looking, and at peace with the world. This peaceful worldview is also powerfully reflected in their art. The frescoes that adorn the walls of their palaces are a celebration of life, not of war. While the palaces of the Assyrian kings are covered in terrifying reliefs of battles, sieges, and the brutal torture of enemies, and the temples of the Egyptian pharaohs are filled with images of the king as a mighty warrior smiting his foes, the art of the Minoans is almost entirely devoid of such scenes. Instead, their walls are filled with vibrant and joyful depictions of the natural world, leaping dolphins, playful monkeys, and beautiful flowering landscapes. They are filled with scenes of elegant courtly life, of processions of beautifully dressed men and women, and of sacred and dangerous rituals like the bull-leaping ceremony. It is an art that celebrates the harmony of nature, the beauty of the human form, and the joy of a peaceful, prosperous, and ceremonial existence. The figure of the warrior, which is so central to the art of almost every other ancient civilization, is conspicuously absent from the great public art of the Minoan palaces. The Minoan Empire itself seems to have been a largely commercial and cultural one, not a military one. While they established colonies and outposts on many of the Aegean islands, such as Thera, Catera, and Melos, these seem to have been primarily trading centers, not military garrisons. They were nodes in a vast commercial network, established to secure sources of raw materials like obsidian, and to facilitate trade with the wider Mediterranean world. The spread of Minoan influence, the process of Minoanization, seems to have been a process of cultural emulation, not of military conquest. The local elites of the Aegean islands eagerly adopted the sophisticated fashions, the artistic styles, and the administrative technologies like the linear A script of the more advanced Minoan civilization, because it was a source of prestige and a way to participate in their prosperous trading network. The Minoans projected their power not through the spear, but through the allure of their sophisticated culture. However, is this image of an entirely peaceful civilization, a Bronze Age utopia, completely accurate? The reality was likely more complex. While the Minoans may have enjoyed a long period of external peace, thanks to their naval supremacy, their society was not necessarily free from violence. The Minoans were skilled metalworkers, and they produced some of the finest bronze weapons in the Aegean, including long, elegant swords and daggers. These were clearly not just ceremonial objects. They were functional and deadly weapons. The discovery of these weapons, along with other martial equipment like boar's tusk helmets, suggests that the Minoans were perfectly capable of warfare when necessary. Their fleets, while primarily used for trade, would have certainly had a military function to protect their merchant ships from pirates, or perhaps to engage in a little piracy themselves, and to enforce their control over the sea lanes. There is also the disturbing evidence of internal violence and conflict. The shocking discovery of evidence for human sacrifice at the temple at Unemphilia, where a young man appears to have been ritually killed at the very moment of a great earthquake, reveals a darker and more brutal side to Minoan religion and society. It suggests that in times of extreme crisis, the Minoans were capable of the ultimate act of violence. The final destruction of the palaces themselves in two major waves was a violent event marked by widespread fires and destruction. Whether this destruction was caused by foreign invaders, by internal rebellions, or by a combination of both, it shows that the long Minoan peace did ultimately come to a very violent end. Some scholars have also suggested that the very openness of the palaces might be deceptive. While they lacked massive external fortification walls, they were complex labyrinthine structures with a limited number of entrances. It is possible that they could have been defended, their doors barricaded, and their roofs manned by archers. In the event of a sudden attack or a popular uprising, the most likely reality is that the Minoan peace was a real and remarkable historical phenomenon, but one that was conditional and not absolute. For several centuries, their powerful fleet was able to successfully deter any major external threats, creating a secure environment in which their unique, unfortified palace culture could flourish. During this golden age, large-scale, state-level warfare was likely rare, and the dominant ideology, as reflected in their art, was one of peace, nature, and ceremony. But this does not mean their world was free from violence. There would have been internal conflicts, there would have been a need for policing and social control, and their religion clearly had a dark and sacrificial component. The Pax Minoica was a remarkable but ultimately fragile achievement. It was a golden age that was made possible by a unique combination of factors: the island's geography, its rich resources, and most importantly, its mastery of the sea. But this very openness, this reliance on naval power and the lack of a tradition of land-based fortified defense would become their fatal weakness. When their fleet was finally shattered, likely by the tsunamis from the great Theran eruption, their peaceful, unwalled palaces were left defenseless and exposed, an easy target for the more aggressive and militaristic Mycenaean warriors from the Greek mainland. The Minoan peace was a brilliant but temporary exception to the brutal rule of warfare that governed the rest of the Bronze Age world, and its end would mark the beginning of a new and more violent era in the history of the Aegean. The brilliant and sophisticated civilization of the Minoans, which had dominated the Aegean for over 500 years, did not fade away gently. It came to a sudden, fiery, and catastrophic end. The final chapter of Minoan history is a dramatic and tragic story of a civilization that was brought to its knees by a powerful 1-2 punch, a devastating natural disaster of almost unimaginable scale, followed by the fatal blow of human aggression and foreign conquest. The fall of the Sea Kings was a complex process, a cascade of events that saw the collapse of their maritime empire, the destruction of their magnificent palaces, and the final absorption of their unique culture into that of their more warlike Mycenaean successors. The end of the Minoan Age was a profound turning point in European history, a moment when a peaceful, artistic, and perhaps matriarchal world gave way to the more militaristic and patriarchal world of the Greek mainland. The beginning of the end was the great volcanic eruption of Theran. As we have seen, this cataclysmic event, which occurred sometime in the 17th or 16th century BCE, was a blow of almost apocalyptic proportions. The tsunamis generated by the collapse of the volcano would have annihilated the Minoan fleet, the very foundation of their security and their economic power. The volcanic ash would have poisoned their fields, leading to famine and social unrest. And the sheer terror of the event, the sun blotted out, the sea roaring, the earth shaking, would have shattered their sense of a stable, harmonious cosmos. A profound ideological crisis for a people whose religion was so deeply tied to the rhythms of the natural world. For many years it was believed that the Theran eruption was the single decisive event that brought the Minoan civilization to an immediate end. The great palaces, it was thought, were all destroyed in this one massive cataclysm. However, as archaeological dating techniques have become more precise, a more complex and more interesting picture has emerged. It now seems that while the eruption was a devastating blow, it was not the final one. The archaeological evidence suggests that the final, fiery destruction of most of the great palace centres, including Phaistos, Malea and Zakros, occurred sometime around 1450 BCE, a century or more after the Theran eruption. The Minoans, it seems, survived the cataclysm, at least for a time. They were a resilient people, and they appear to have managed to rebuild their fleet, to restore their trade networks, and to re-establish a semblance of their former prosperity. But they were a deeply wounded and fundamentally weakened civilization. Their economy would have been crippled, their population may have been reduced, and their self-confidence and their faith in the old order would have been profoundly shaken. They were now a vulnerable power in an increasingly dangerous world. It was in this weakened and traumatized state that they would have to face a new and rising threat from the north, the ambitious and warlike Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The Mycenaeans were a culture of warrior kings who dominated mainland Greece from about 1600 to 1100 BCE. Their centers of power were heavily fortified citadels like Mycenae and Tiryns. For centuries they had been the junior partners in the Aegean world, eagerly importing the sophisticated luxury goods, the artistic styles, and the administrative technologies of the more advanced Minoan civilization. They learned to write their own early form of the Greek language using a script, Linear B, which was a direct adaptation of the Minoan Linear A. But as Minoan power waned in the aftermath of the Theran eruption, the balance of power in the Aegean began to shift dramatically. The students were now ready to challenge and to overthrow their former masters. Sometime around 1450 BCE, a decisive and dramatic change occurred on the island of Crete. This was the moment of the great wave of destructions that wiped out most of the major Minoan sites. But one site, the greatest of them all, the palace of Knossos, was mysteriously spared from this destruction. Instead, it seems to have been taken over by a new ruling power. The archaeological evidence for this takeover is clear and compelling. A new and distinctly Mycenaean style of pottery, known as palace style, appears at the site. The artistic motifs on the frescoes and seals become more rigid, more formal, and more militaristic, incorporating Mycenaean themes like the figure-8 shield and formal chariot processions. The burial customs also change, with the appearance of Mycenaean-style warrior graves in the vicinity of the palace, where the deceased are buried with a full set of bronze weapons, including swords, spears, and daggers. But the most definitive and irrefutable piece of evidence comes from the palace archives. The final archive of clay tablets found in the ruins of the palace at Knossos. The tablets that were accidentally baked and preserved in the fire that finally destroyed the building are not written in the Minoan Linear A script. They are written in Linear B. The decipherment of Linear B proved that the language of these final tablets was an early form of Greek. The conclusion was inescapable. In its final phase, the great palace of Minos at Knossos was being administered by Greek-speaking Mycenaeans. The exact nature of this Mycenaean takeover is still debated. Was it a full-scale military invasion, a violent conquest that saw a Mycenaean army land on Crete, destroy the other major palaces, and then seize Knossos as its prize? This would explain the widespread destructions of 1450 BCE, or was it a more gradual process? Perhaps a dynastic marriage that went wrong, or even a coup led by a local faction that was supported by Mycenaean mercenaries. Some scholars have even proposed that the takeover may have been relatively peaceful, with the weakened Minoan elite inviting a Mycenaean warlord and his followers to take control of the palace to help restore order after a period of internal strife. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was a profound cultural transformation. A new Greek-speaking warrior aristocracy was now in control of the most important center on the island. They seem to have ruled from Knossos for several generations, from about 1450 to 1375 BCE, adapting the sophisticated Minoan administrative system to their own needs. The Linear B tablets from Knossos are very similar to those found on the mainland at Pylos and Mycenae. They are meticulous but mundane administrative records, inventories of the palace storerooms that list vast quantities of sheep. Over 100,000 are recorded, wool, textiles, chariots, and weapons. They paint a picture of a highly centralized, bureaucratic and militarized state, ruled by a king, or oneax, who controlled the economic life of the kingdom with a focus on military production and the textile industry. This was a very different world from the one depicted in the earlier, more peaceful Minoan frescoes. Crete was now an outpost of the Mycenaean world. This final hybrid phase of Minoan Mycenaean culture came to a fiery and definitive end around 1375 BCE. In a single massive wave of destruction, the great palace of Knossos was violently destroyed by a fire so intense that it baked the clay tablets in the archives and turned the gypsum walls to plaster. This was the final catastrophic collapse of the Minoan palatial civilization. The cause of this final destruction is another great mystery. Who burned Knossos? One powerful theory is that it was the result of a massive internal uprising by the native Minoan population, a final desperate rebellion to overthrow their foreign Mycenaean overlords after 3 generations of subjugation. Another theory suggests that the final destruction was the work of a new wave of invaders from the Greek mainland, perhaps a rival Mycenaean kingdom like Mycenae itself, that sought to eliminate Knossos as a commercial and political competitor. A third possibility points to natural causes, such as another major earthquake, a disaster to which the island is prone. Whatever the cause, the destruction of Knossos in the early 14th century BCE marked the end of an era. With the collapse of the last great palace center, the sophisticated Bronze Age civilization of Crete effectively came to an end. The island entered a long period of decline and relative poverty. The great skills of the fresco painters, the stone vase carvers, and the master builders were lost. The art of writing disappeared from the island for several hundred years. Crete became a cultural backwater, a shadow of its former glorious self. Some Minoan traditions may have survived in small, isolated mountain refuges, the places where the later Greeks believed the Aetio-Cretans, or true Cretans, still lived. But the great palatial civilization was over. The Minoan chapter of history was closed, but its profound influence was already deeply embedded in the Mycenaean culture that had replaced it, a culture that would in turn become the foundation for the classical world of the Greeks. The peaceful, open world of the Minoans was no match for the more violent and militaristic age that followed. The shadow of the Mycenaean warriors had fallen over the island of the goddess, and the light of Europe's first great civilization had been extinguished. The fiery destruction of the great palace at Knossos around 1375 BCE marked the definitive end of the Minoan civilization as a political and economic power. The complex palace-centered society that had dominated the Aegean for over 500 years collapsed, and the island of Crete sank into a long period of relative obscurity and poverty. But the end of a civilization is rarely a clean break. The Minoans did not simply vanish without a trace. Their influence, the product of centuries of cultural and commercial dominance, was too deeply woven into the fabric of the Aegean world to be completely erased. The Minoan legacy is a complex and often subtle one, a series of powerful echoes that resonated through the subsequent Mycenaean and later Greek cultures. It is a legacy that can be seen in the myths the Greeks told, the gods they worshipped, the art they created, and the very language they wrote. The Minoans were the great tutors of the early Greek world, the forgotten ancestors who provided many of the foundational elements upon which the later glories of classical Greece would be built. The most immediate and direct inheritors of the Minoan legacy were their conquerors, the Mycenaeans. For centuries, the Mycenaean warrior kings of the Greek mainland had looked to Crete with a mixture of awe and envy. They were the provincials, the less developed culture on the periphery of the great Minoan Thalassocracy. They eagerly imported Minoan luxury goods. They hired Minoan craftsmen to decorate their own nascent palaces, and they adopted Minoan styles in their pottery and their art. The famous inlaid daggers from the shaft graves of Mycenaean, with their beautiful lively scenes of hunting and nature, are believed to have been made either by Minoan artisans or by Mycenaean craftsmen who had been expertly trained in the Minoan style. The early frescoes that decorated the palaces of Mycenaean Pylos also show a strong Minoan influence in their technique and their subject matter. But the most profound and important technological transfer from the Minoans to the Mycenaeans was the art of writing. The Mycenaeans had no writing system of their own. To manage the increasingly complex economies of their own palace states, they adopted and adapted the Minoan Linear A script to write their own, completely different Indo-European language, an early form of Greek. The result was the script we call Linear B. While many of the signs were borrowed directly from Linear A, the underlying structure was changed to better fit the syllabic nature of the Greek language. This act of cultural borrowing was a pivotal moment in European history. It marks the first time that the Greek language was ever written down, and it provided the Mycenaeans with the essential bureaucratic tool they needed to administer their kingdoms. The clay tablets of Linear B, with their meticulous records of taxes, rations, and military deployments, are a direct inheritance from the administrative traditions of the Minoan palaces. The Mycenaean conquest of Knossos around 1450 BCE accelerated this process of cultural transfer. For several generations, a Greek-speaking elite ruled over a largely Minoan population from the greatest of all the Minoan palaces. This period of direct contact and coexistence would have led to a deep and profound fusion of the two cultures. The Mycenaeans, while the political masters, would have been surrounded by the magnificent art, the sophisticated architecture, and the ancient religious traditions of the Minoans. They absorbed a vast amount of Minoan culture, and they would carry this legacy with them when they eventually returned to the mainland. This Minoan influence is particularly evident in the realm of religion. The Mycenaeans brought their own pantheon of Indo-European sky gods to Crete, the ancestors of the later Greek Olympians, but they also clearly adopted and syncretized many of the deities and religious concepts of the older Minoan civilization. The Linear B tablets from Knossos list offerings being made not only to Greek gods like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hera, but also to a number of non-Greek, presumably Minoan deities. One of the most important of these is the Mistress of the Labyrinth, likely a powerful goddess who was the patron deity of the palace at Knossos, a direct descendant of the great Minoan mother goddess. The later Greek pantheon is filled with goddesses, such as Athena, Artemis, and Aphrodite, who have strong pre-Greek Minoan roots. The emphasis on powerful, independent female deities in Greek religion is a direct legacy of the Minoan world. Even the geography of Greek mythology is deeply rooted in Minoan Crete. For the later Greeks, Crete was a place of deep and primordial power, the setting for some of their most important founding myths. It was in a cave on the Cretan mountain of Ida that the infant Zeus was said to have been hidden from his cannibalistic father Cronus and raised to maturity. The fact that the king of the Greek gods had his origins on Crete is a powerful testament to the island's ancient and sacred status. The legendary King Minos himself was adopted into the Greek mythological system as a son of Zeus. After his death, he became one of the three great judges of the underworld, a figure of immense wisdom and authority. The stories of the Labyrinth, the Minotaur, and the great craftsman Daedalus are all powerful, if distorted, memories of the architectural and artistic glories of the Minoan Golden Age. The myth of the Labyrinth is almost certainly a memory of the vast, complex, and maze-like palace of Knossos itself. With the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BCE, Greece entered a dark age, and the art of writing was lost for several centuries. But the Minoan legacy was not entirely forgotten. It was preserved in the oral traditions, in the stories, myths, and legends that were passed down from generation to generation. When the Greeks re-emerged from their dark age and began to develop the new political system of the polis or city-state in the archaic period, these ancient memories of Crete continued to shape their worldview. The archaic and classical Greeks looked back to the age of Minos as a kind of golden age, a time of great power and justice. The philosopher Plato, in his work The Laws, uses the mythical constitution of Minos as a model for an ideal, well-ordered state. He saw Minos as the perfect lawgiver, a king who had created a society of unparalleled stability. This admiration for the Minoan past is a recurring theme in Greek thought. The Minoan artistic legacy also endured. The vibrant, naturalistic style of Minoan art, with its love of flowing lines and its celebration of the natural world, was a profound influence on the development of later Greek art. The graceful floral motifs, the swirling spiral patterns, and the dynamic animal forms that are so common in Minoan art can be seen in the decorative arts of the archaic and even the classical periods. The Minoans were the first great naturalists of European art, and they taught the Greeks how to see and to represent the beauty of the living world. Even the Roman world, which inherited so much from the Greeks, also felt the distant echo of the Minoans. The Roman poet Virgil, in his great epic the Aeneid, consciously modelled the journey of his hero Aeneas on the journey of the Greek hero Odysseus. When Aeneas and his men finally reach Italy, the first thing they do is to seek out the temple of Apollo at Comene. The gates of this temple, Virgil tells us, were decorated with a magnificent series of carvings created by the legendary craftsman Daedalus, depicting the story of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. For Virgil, the story of Minoan Crete was the foundational story of the Italian landscape, the first great myth that greeted the Trojan ancestors of the Roman people. The rediscovery of the Minoan civilization in the 20th century created its own new and powerful legacy. The vibrant, peaceful, and seemingly matriarchal world that Arthur Evans uncovered at Knossos became a powerful symbol for many modern intellectual and artistic movements. The surrealist painters of the early 20th century were fascinated by the dreamlike, psychological quality of Minoan art. Feminists in the 1960s and 70s seized upon the image of the snake goddess and the powerful priestesses as evidence of a lost prehistoric matriarchal utopia, a peaceful, goddess-worshipping society that had existed before the rise of the patriarchal, warlike Indo-Europeans. While this is a highly romanticized and probably inaccurate interpretation of the evidence, it shows the enduring power of the Minoan world to inspire new ways of thinking about society, gender, and religion. The Minoan civilization was the first great leap forward in the story of European culture. They were the great pioneers, the people who created the first writing system, the first monumental architecture, and the first great naturalistic art on European soil. They were the ones who first harnessed the power of the sea, creating a vibrant, interconnected world in the Aegean that had not existed before. Their culture was largely subsumed by the Mycenaeans, and their memory was transformed into myth. But their influence was a profound and enduring one. They were the silent partners in the later achievements of the Greeks. The echoes of their labyrinthine palaces and their joyful frescoes can still be seen and felt in the very foundations of Western civilization. After the final absorption of the Etruscan cities into the Roman state in the 1st century BCE, a great silence descended upon Etruria. Their language ceased to be spoken. Their sacred texts were no longer copied, and their unique cultural identity dissolved into the great melting pot of the Roman Empire. For over 1500 years, the Etruscans were a forgotten people, their existence known only through the often biased and hostile accounts of the Greek and Roman writers who had been their rivals and conquerors. Their magnificent cities of the dead, with their painted tombs and their golden treasures, lay hidden and undisturbed beneath the rolling hills of Tuscany. The story of the Etruscans is therefore a tale in two parts: the story of their life and decline in antiquity, and the story of their second life, their gradual and dramatic rediscovery, which began in the Renaissance and continues to this day. This is the story of Etruscology, the patient, often frustrating, and sometimes thrilling process of piecing together a lost world from the echoes it left behind in the earth. The first stirrings of a renewed interest in the pre-Roman past of Italy came during the Renaissance. In an age obsessed with the classical world of Greece and Rome, the discovery of artifacts that were clearly not Roman, but were of a sophisticated and unknown style, sparked a new curiosity. The most famous of these early discoveries was the unearthing of the Chimera of Arezzo in 1553. During the construction of new fortifications in the Tuscan city of Arezzo, workers discovered a magnificent, life-sized bronze statue of a mythical beast, part lion, part goat, part snake. The statue, a masterpiece of bronze casting, was unlike anything seen before. It was brought to the attention of the ruler of Florence, Cosimo I de' Medici, a great patron of the arts. Cosimo was fascinated by the statue and added it to his personal collection, where he is said to have personally cleaned it. This spectacular find, along with other discoveries like the statue of the Orator, demonstrated that a powerful and highly artistic civilization had flourished in Tuscany long before the Romans. This period, however, was one of collecting curiosities rather than scientific investigation. The finds were seen as beautiful objects, but their historical context and the culture that created them remained shrouded in mystery. A more systematic, if often destructive, interest in the Etruscan past began in the 18th and early 19th centuries, fueled by the Grand Tour. Wealthy European aristocrats, scholars and artists travelling through Italy in search of classical antiquity began to hear tales of tombs filled with beautiful painted vases and golden treasures being found in the lands of ancient Etruria. This sparked a wave of excavations that were, in reality, little more than treasure hunts. This was the era of the tombarolo, the professional tomb robber, a figure who has haunted the Etruscan necropolises for millennia. Local farmers and entrepreneurs, realizing the immense value of the artifacts buried beneath their fields, began to systematically search for and plunder the ancient tombs. They would probe the ground with long metal rods until they hit the telltale void of a subterranean chamber. They would then break in, seize the most valuable and marketable items, the Greek-painted pottery, the gold jewelry, the bronze mirrors, and sell them on the burgeoning international art market. In the process, they would often destroy the context of the tomb, smashing less valuable items and paying no attention to the skeletal remains or the tomb's architecture. While these early tomb robbers were responsible for the destruction of a vast amount of irreplaceable archaeological information, they were also the ones who revealed the sheer scale and richness of the Etruscan world that lay hidden beneath the soil. The birth of Etruscology as a more scientific discipline can be traced to the mid-19th century and the work of dedicated scholars who sought to move beyond simple treasure hunting. The most important of these early figures was the English writer and diplomat, George Dennis. From 1842 to 1847, Denis travelled extensively on horseback through the remote and often dangerous countryside of Tuscany and Lazio, meticulously documenting the remains of the ancient Etruscan cities and their necropolises. His book, The Cities and Cemeteries of Etruria, first published in 1848, was a landmark achievement. It was a detailed, scholarly, and yet deeply personal and engaging travelogue that provided the first comprehensive guide to the lost world of the Etruscans. Denis described the visible ruins. He climbed down into freshly opened tombs to record their paintings before they faded, and he synthesized all the available historical and archaeological evidence. His work brought the Etruscan civilization to the attention of a wide international audience and created a detailed record of many sites and tombs that have since been damaged or destroyed. The 19th century was also the age of the great discoveries, when a series of spectacular finds provided the raw material that would shape our understanding of Etruscan culture. At the southern Etruscan city of Caere, modern Cavietori, the vast Banditacha necropolis, with its city-like layout of great earthen tumuli, was systematically explored for the first time. The most sensational find came in 1836, with the discovery of the Regalini Galassi tomb, an unlooted princely tomb from the 7th century BCE. The tomb was a treasure trove of unimaginable wealth, filled with objects of gold, silver, ivory, and bronze. There was a spectacular golden pectoral, decorated with tiny animals, a complete bronze chariot, and a host of silver vessels imported from the Near East. The Regalini Galassi tomb was a stunning revelation of the immense wealth and the far-reaching international connections of the Etruscan elite during their Orientalizing period. At Tarquinia, the ongoing discovery of the painted tombs was like opening a series of time capsules. Each newly discovered tomb provided another vibrant, colourful window into Etruscan life. The frescoes, carefully copied by artists before their colours began to fade upon exposure to the air, completely changed the perception of the Etruscans. They were no longer seen as a grim and mysterious people, but as a joyful, life-affirming culture that celebrated music, dance, and feasting. At the city of Volci, the excavations led by Lucien Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon, in the 1820s and 30s, turned the site into a virtual mine of Greek pottery. His crews unearthed thousands of the highest quality painted vases from Athens, which the Etruscan aristocracy had imported in vast quantities. This flood of new material not only demonstrated the Etruscans' immense wealth and their taste for foreign luxury goods, but it also fundamentally rewrote the history of Greek art, providing the names and styles of many previously unknown Athenian painters. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen Etruscology mature into a modern scientific discipline. The focus has shifted from the tombs of the elite to a more holistic understanding of Etruscan society. Archaeologists now systematically excavate settlements, sanctuaries, and industrial sites to learn about the lives of ordinary people. The discovery of the Etruscan port at Gravisca, the main harbour for Tarquinia, was a major breakthrough. The excavations revealed a cosmopolitan trading hub, with a sanctuary where not only Etruscans but also Greek and Phoenician merchants left offerings to their shared gods. This provided a vivid picture of the international and multicultural world in which the Etruscans operated. At sites like Poggio Civitate, an aristocratic residence from the 7th century, archaeologists have uncovered not just the monumental building, but the workshops where its magnificent terracotta sculptures were made. Modern science has opened up new frontiers in the study of the Etruscans. DNA analysis of human remains from Etruscan tombs is providing new complex evidence for the old debate about their origins. Residue analysis on their pottery can tell us what they were eating and drinking at their banquets, and non-invasive survey techniques like ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry are allowing archaeologists to map the complete layout of buried necropolises and even to see inside unopened tombs without ever breaking the soil. The rediscovery of Etruria is an ongoing story. Every year new tombs are discovered, sometimes by accident by farmers, sometimes by police tracking the activities of modern tombaroli. Each new find adds another small, precious piece to the great puzzle of the Etruscan enigma. The enduring fascination of the Etruscans lies in this incompleteness. The lost language, the fragmentary evidence, the overwhelming reliance on the art of the dead, it all forces us to be historical detectives, to piece together a lost world from the beautiful and mysterious echoes it left behind in the earth. The Etruscans are not just a dead civilization to be studied, they are an active archaeological adventure, their secrets still rising from the Tuscan soil. Our journey through the labyrinth of legend and the silent painted cities of the dead has come to an end. We have pursued the Minoan enigma, chasing the ghostly whispers of Europe's first great civilization, a culture that rose from the sea and was, in the end, consumed by it. We have seen a people who, from the beautiful and strategic island of Crete, built a vast and peaceful maritime empire, a Thalassocracy whose power was based not on the might of its armies, but on the speed of its ships and the allure of its sophisticated culture. We have walked the sprawling, unwalled corridors of the great palace at Knossos, a structure so vast and complex that its memory was preserved for 1,000 years in the myth of the Labyrinth. We have marvelled at their art, an art of joyful celebration, of vibrant colour and fluid movement, a world of leaping dolphins, sacred bulls and powerful goddesses that stands in stark contrast to the grim martial art of its contemporaries. We have seen a society where women appear to have held a position of remarkable power and prominence, a world of priestesses and elegant court ladies who participated fully in the public and ceremonial life of their civilization. We have delved into their unique, nature-focused religion, a world of mountaintop sanctuaries and sacred caves, of bull-leaping rituals and the enigmatic snake goddess. We have witnessed the awesome and terrifying power of nature in the great cataclysm of the Theran Eruption, a volcanic explosion that shattered their golden age and left them vulnerable to the rising power of the more warlike Mycenaean Greeks. We have deciphered the language of their conquerors, the Linear B script, only to be confronted by the deeper mystery of their own, unreadable Linear A, a language whose secrets are still locked away. The Minoans were the great pioneers of the Aegean world. They were the first to build monumental architecture on European soil, the first to create a truly naturalistic art, and the first to use a written language to administer a complex state. They were the great intermediaries, the people who absorbed the influences of the older civilizations of Egypt and the Near East, and transmitted them, through their own unique cultural lens, to the nascent world of the Greek mainland. Their civilization was a brilliant but fragile creation, a peaceful and prosperous world that was ultimately no match for the violent and chaotic forces of the Late Bronze Age. They were overthrown by the Mycenaeans, their palaces were burned, and their culture was absorbed and transformed. But their legacy was not erased. It became a foundational, though often invisible, part of the later Greek world. The myths the Greeks told, the gods they worshipped, and the art they created were all profoundly shaped by the echoes of this lost, magnificent civilization. The rediscovery of the Minoans by Sir Arthur Evans was a rediscovery of a lost chapter of our own history. It is a powerful reminder that the story of Europe did not begin with the classical Greeks, but in the much deeper, more mysterious and more joyful world of the Sea Kings of Crete. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the labyrinth. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the graceful dance of the bull leapers and the enigmatic smile of the snake goddess.